All right, we are looking at Millikan Part 2, page 26, Part 1 on page 26. Here we go. Number 1, I'm just going to read you the answers, and then if there are any questions, we can go back and talk about it. Number 1 is C. Number 2 was difficult. You agree?
Yes.
So we'll give you a bonus point on that if you get it. That was also C. Anybody get it? Okay. Number 3 is A. Number 4 is D. 5 is B. 6 A. 7 C. 8 also was difficult. If you get it, we'll count it as a bonus. That was B. Anybody get it? Oh, almost everybody. I should rethink that.
No. No. You said it already.
Number 9 is B. 10 D. 11 D. 12 D. 13 C. 14 D. 15 B. Any questions? Devin?
If you got a bonus on this part, would it count for the next part too?
Yes, we're going to count it all together. All right, we're ready for the next one then? Page 27, part 2. Number 1 is N. 2, N. 3, S. 4, O. 5, S. 6, B. 7, B. 8, O. 9, N. 10, S. 11, N. 12, N. 13, S. 14, B. 15, N. All right, now probably some of those that you're not clear about. So do you have some questions? Stephen.
What was 1?
N. Alex?
What was 4?
4 was O. Michaela? It means black people and white people serving together. They had their own regiments. They were not integrated. Yeah, but that's not integrated. That's like having a master over slaves. I'm not saying it's the same thing, but you wouldn't say that the on a plantation that the workers were integrated because the foreman was white. That's kind of the situation. Devin?
What was 7?
7 was B. All right. Any others that you don't understand the right answer? Michaela?
Did they ever give the South supply?
No.
And why does it feel to be dependent on the South?
Well, they depended. Wait, read the question again.
Because they depended on Europe for supplies, and you said they were South.
Oh, they didn't give them supplies. They bought them. So there was trade. That's the only place they could get manufactured goods was from England, especially, since they couldn't get from the north anymore because they're at war. So, but that doesn't indicate that they were given. That just means that they were able to purchase supplies. Okay, any others? All right, count up the number that you end up with as a negative. Make sure you consider your bonus point if you had any, if you had one. And put it See, are these pages back to back? All right, put your score at the top of page 26 and circle it so I can find it easily. And then pass it to whoever's in the front, and I will collect those.
All I needed is
He
on
takes off- he
26.
takes off 3 points.
Page 26 is all I need.
Yes, he takes off 3 points. Yeah. No, yeah, the page we just did, you forgot just because it was,
I didn't forget anything. It
you
wasn't
didn't
given
go
to me.
down that one.
As we mentioned last time, Abraham Lincoln won re-election to a second term, largely because of the voting of soldiers in the Union Army. He won over 70-some% of their vote. Who was he running against? You remember? The Democrats? Right, George McClellan. Lincoln's second inaugural address may be the best speech he ever gave. I know everybody knows about the Gettysburg Address, but if you go to the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., you'll not only see the Gettysburg Address there, you'll see his first inaugural address and his second. And the second one, I think, has some very instructive information for us as to his attitude. As you can see the war winding down. So let's look at this together. It's very short. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. In other words, what's he saying? Who's responsible for the existence of slavery in America? Just the South? No, he recognizes the North is responsible too. Because who was it that brought slaves to the South? Northern merchants. So he's recognizing that. That shows some, I think, some good insight on his part, a non-hypocritical attitude in that way, recognizing that God was judging our nation as a whole. It wasn't just judging the South, but our whole nation, that God allowed slavery to exist and then brought judgment on us. As the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in the living God always ascribe to him? In other words, as believers in God, are we going to take away some of the attributes that we have always believed in him, or will we continue to believe that he is who we've always believed him to be? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. But we hope and pray this war will end soon. Yet if God wills it to continue until all the wealth piled up by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk. Now he's talking about slaves. So he said, if it's God's will that this war continue until 250 years worth of the slaves' wages would be paid, basically, by the nation, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash, every time a slave was whipped, shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Man, I'll tell you, this Lincoln here is showing more biblical sense than many preachers. He's saying, if God determines that this war must continue in order for his judgment to be just for what we have done, then so be it. He's going to submit himself to the plan of God. With malice toward none. What's that mean? What's malice?
No, this nature.
Yeah. So, hatred toward none, charity for all. So who's he talking about? Who's he talking about when he says, we're not going to have any hatred, we're going to have charity? All who? Every time you see the word none and all, you have to ask, none of what? All of what? So what's he talking about here? Who is he saying that his attitude is one of not having hatred, but rather of charity? No? That would none of the God, none of God? No? None of who? All of who? Who might he have hatred toward? Who did many of the Northerners in Union have hatred toward?
The South.
The South. He's saying, with malice toward none. We're not going to have hatred toward the South. Charity for them. With firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we're in, to bind up the nation's wounds. Now, what's going to happen is in this election where he was elected president, there are a lot of Republicans that were elected called radical Republicans. They didn't want to bind up the nation's wounds. They wanted to punish the South. He has a different attitude. Unfortunately, after his assassination, they would prevail. To care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, and do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. So what was Lincoln's attitude? His attitude was such that he said, when this war is over, we're not going to go in there with retribution. We're not going to go and try to punish the South. We're going to do what we can to bring us back together again, to heal the wounds, to even take care of their orphans and their widows. That we all look as if we're one country again. That was Lincoln's attitude. And we'll see later that that was not carried out. All right, so next we move into the final battles as we're in 1865. If you need to leave something, we're recording right now, so if you need to leave something, go ahead. We'll take care of it. There are different battles that take place here that we're not going to talk much about. There are raids down here, here in this area of Virginia. We have Sherman, having reached Savannah, now marches up through the Carolinas into this area. So there's still battles going on, but the main battle is going on at Petersburg, which is on the way to Richmond. Again, the idea is to get to Richmond. Here's Richmond. Here's Petersburg down here. So try to keep that in mind as we go to the next slide. So we're going to see Union forces coming from Spotsylvania, where they had fought recently. Grant's coming down this way. They're going to battle at Cold Harbor, and then they'll come down this way to try to get around to Richmond. But all the way, Lee is keeping Grant from flanking him. So even down here, he is positioning himself so that Grant can't get through. And he sets himself up in front of Petersburg. Now, Petersburg was an important city. It's right on the river here. And so the Confederacy needed to defend that. Plus, if Petersburg fell, then Grant would be able to come up from the south up to Richmond. So that's why Lee has to defend this. So there's going to be a battle take place at Petersburg. As Grant arrives in July of 1864, and this continues on to 1865. So it's a long siege. Grant's used to a siege because he did it at Vicksburg, right? So it's a 25-mile long siege line against Petersburg, Virginia, which is a major railroad junction feeding into Richmond from the south. So capture Petersburg, you keep supplies from getting into Richmond. If Petersburg is captured, Richmond would be cut off. In regard to the eventual capture of Richmond, orders were given to gut the city. Jefferson Davis and his cabinet must be killed on the spot, is what the Union command was given. Supplies were non-existent for the Confederates, with Sherman marching from Savannah north through the Carolinas. Johnston could do nothing to stop Sherman. And so things are looking pretty dire here. You see this cannon is mounted on a railroad car, so it could be moved along the railroad. It's called the Dictator. They call it a Union terror weapon. It's a giant mortar, 220-pound shells, could go more than 2.5 miles. Here at Petersburg, a picture was taken of infantrymen waiting for another charge against the Confederate works. 14 out of every 100 would fall. So you can see they're all ready. They're ready to go up over and charge. So here's a closer look at Petersburg, the Union forces, and the Confederates. They've got some down here just in case Grant tries to come around, but most of them are concentrated here. President Davis and his cabinet at this point abandoned Richmond. Well, on April 1st. Lee attempted to escape the increasing vice grips of Grant, but was cut off at every turn. At Petersburg, there were a number of Pennsylvania soldiers who had experience in the mines of Pennsylvania, and they suggested digging a tunnel from the Union lines under the Confederate lines, planting explosives and blowing it up. And that would, kill a lot of soldiers and enable them to have a line to go through to then rush through into Petersburg. So it was approved to do that. So these Pennsylvania miners dug a tunnel, and what happened is that when the explosion occurred, it caused a huge sinkhole. So the Union soldiers are ready when the explosion goes off to rush through the Confederate line that would be opened up. They didn't expect a huge sinkhole. So they ran down one side of the crater, and as they're trying to come up the other side, the Confederate line recovered, and so they simply lined up on the opposite side of the crater, and it's like shooting, fish in a barrel. There are all these Union soldiers stuck down there in the crater. So it ended up being a very good strategy. The Confederates were able to kill a lot of Union soldiers that way. This is some of the siege work that's built. Trenches were constructed. And we move on to where finally Lee sees that there's not much more that he can do. He was urged by many to engage. Yes?
I think this one, is it on A, B, C?
C was here. Davis and his cabinet abandoned Richmond. Lee was urged by many to engage in guerrilla warfare. Say, look, we don't have the numbers to meet them on the battlefield anymore. Let's just divide up, split up, hide out, and we'll just attack them here and there. Guerrilla warfare. Lee would not take part in any action that would avoid the inevitable. And by this time he saw that there's no way the South is going to win. And so why prolong the agony? He said it would just create even more bitterness between the two sides if they conducted guerrilla warfare. And he sadly informed his men that he was compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources, and that he was determined to avoid the useless sacrifice of those whose past services have endeared them to their countrymen. So to save lives, Lee decided it was time to give up. This shows a picture of Richmond on fire. The residents of Richmond fled along with the cabinet, the president and his cabinet. They set fire to the city just to keep the Union from getting the supplies that were there. The South requested a meeting to discuss peace terms, but the South wanted to have independence still, and the North wasn't going to give it to them. As Union troops come into Charleston, South Carolina, jubilant slaves welcome them. So here we are. Here's Petersburg. Here's Richmond. Lee is moving along, trying to prevent Grant from getting all the way around, but can't do it. Finally, he realizes there's nothing more that can be done. And so, let's see. I wanted to keep that picture up there. This is the house in which Lee and Grant met, the home of Wilmer McLean of Appomattox. They met together on Palm Sunday afternoon, April 9th, 1865, and they agreed on the terms of surrender. Grant, although he was known for being unconditional surrender Grant, was very lenient in the terms that he gave Lee. Confederate soldiers were to lay down their arms and go home. They were permitted to take with them any personal weapons and horses. One of the soldiers nearby, Zeb Thompson of Alabama, had participated in many of the greatest battles of the war during his service to the Confederacy and had been wounded 3 times. What's significant about him? Well, he was one of several black men who was there following Lee to the end. Also present was Private John P. Leach, one of 2 blacks and 10 whites left in Company C of the 53rd North Carolina Regiment. These were just a few of at least 50,000 and as many as 100,000 black slaves and freemen who served the Confederate cause in some military or naval capacity. Really, the closest anyone came to having an integrated military, it was the Confederacy, because there were some black men here and there fighting alongside white men for the Confederacy. I've read of at least one instance, and I think there were more, where a slave accompanied his master into battle, and the master was killed. The slave took up arms and fought in his place. The house in which this surrender took place is rather ironic, because the first battle of the war took place where? What's the first battle?
Bull Run.
Bull Run, or Manassas. There was a man who owned land in that area, and so they were fighting on his land. His name was Wilmer McLean. He said, the war started in my backyard and ended in my parlor. He moved after that battle to a place. Some say he moved to get out of danger of the battles, but others point out that he had a underground business going that it was better for him to live at Appomattox. But it's interesting, the war started near one house where he lived. He moved, and it ended in the house in which he lived there. I usually have a painting up of this scene. I don't see it. I'll have to get it up later. Oh, there it is. It's up there. I wasn't looking at far enough. If you look at this painting back here, you see Lee sitting at a desk, Grant sitting at another desk over here. If you go to Appomattox Courthouse, they recreated this room to look exactly as it did at that time, and there's every reason to believe that this painting is accurate. One of the those who described the scene noted the contrast between General Lee and General Grant. They said that Grant arrived with mud-splattered boots and uniform, a bit unkempt. Lee arrived in his uniform, looking spick and span, looking like a perfect Southern gentleman military leader. This picture shows Lee leaving, the great respect that can be seen between the two. In fact, as Lee exited the house, Union soldiers, knowing what happened, erupted in celebration. You can imagine. But Grant quickly ordered a cessation, saying, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again." So, very magnanimous toward Lee and toward the Confederacy. Here's another painting of Lee and Grant at Appomattox. Well, what kind of reception did Lee get from his own soldiers, having surrendered? The title says it all. We still love you, General Lee. He was a highly respected man among his own soldiers, as well as those who opposed him. As is written in General Lee as I knew him, his army broke up and followed him, weeping and sobbing. But that's not the end of Robert E. Lee. He steps on the stage once more. It's at this point, as the war is not quite over, this is the last major battle. There will be still some more battles to be fought, but this is essentially the end. And a handful of men would step up to tip the balance toward peace and reconciliation. Foremost, it begins almost ironically with Robert E. Lee. Lee, you can imagine at this time, is a man in limbo. He's a man without an army, a general without an army. He has no job, no position. He is on the losing side. He had no country, essentially, anymore. He's a paroled prisoner of war living in occupied territory that was no longer the Confederate capital, but not yet a Union state. Beyond the heartache of the war and the heartbreak of the defeat of his proud army, his own familial possessions had been ransacked by the Union. This had been his home, called the Custis Lee Mansion. That home and the surrounding land had been confiscated by a Union general who turned it into a graveyard for fallen Union soldiers. It was with bitterness that this officer remarked that he wanted Bobby Lee to be able to look from his front porch and see all the men whose deaths he had caused. That graveyard is today Arlington National Cemetery, outside of Washington, D.C. But for all of this, Lee never revealed any bitterness. If there was any hardening of the heart, he never showed it. We do know that he was depressed, sleeping late and often. The sight of the Confederate capital, burned and destroyed as it was, must have wrenched his soul. The shambles, the refugees, the beggars, the scorched brick skeletons that hovered over the rubble-filled streets. This must have terribly pained Lee, who was both a passionate man and a nationalist. The fact was, at this juncture, the slightest word from Lee, even a small veiled hint that could be misconstrued, could have done much to reignite Southern passions and breathe new life into the remaining Southern forces still at war. It could have unearthed a deadly guerrilla struggle. It most certainly could have unleashed organized chaos and legitimized ongoing discord. As one of Lee's colonels once said, "You only have to blow the bugle." The entire Confederacy was looking to him for guidance. resisting the temptation to call on the Confederacy to take advantage of the Union's temporary disarray and somehow press the chaos of the North to its advantage, Lee decidedly went in the other direction toward peace. Around this time, we learned that Lee did several remarkable things. First was that near month's end, he sent a letter to Jefferson Davis. Now remember, Lee had already sent a formal letter of his final operations, losses, and surrender. Also remember, he is no longer a general of anything. He commands no men, and there was no responsibility to send yet another letter to Davis. But Lee, always a keen student of public opinion, every day he would rise and read the northern newspapers. He wanted to shape the course of events even further. In his letter to Davis, he took dead aim at Davis's proposed new phase of warfare, guerrilla warfare. Davis wanted to wage it. Lee said no to guerrilla warfare, telling Davis it must not be fought, it probably couldn't be won, and it should not be waged. We also learned he did something else quite important, even remarkable, around this time. He gave an interview to a journalist. Not a Southern journalist, as you might expect, but to a Northern journalist, to Thomas Cook of the New York Herald. Lee wanted the widest possible audience for his words. In more than one, we learned the interview was extraordinary. Just prior to this, Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. And Lee condemned the assassination of Lincoln in the harshest of terms, calling it the most execrable and deplorable of all measures. Second, he celebrated the end of slavery, saying that the best men of the South had long wanted to do away with this institution. Just days before, whenever Lee said we, he always meant the South. Just days before, whenever Lee said the country, he always meant the Confederacy. And yet now he was freely speaking as a citizen of the United States and calling on all other Southerners to become good citizens of the United States. Lee would not become a citizen of the United States in the 5 short-lived years left of his life, nor for another 100 years thereafter. He had applied for citizenship and was approved, but the application was lost. It wasn't found for another 100 years, and at that point, he was given his citizenship. Lee would also promise, and this too is important, quote, to make any sacrifice or perform any honorable act that would tend toward the restoration of peace, unquote. So how do we evaluate the man Robert E. Lee? In a conversation I was having with some men at my church about a year ago, I'm not sure how Lee even came up, but this man expostulated the idea that Lee was a traitor. Is that how we should remember him? Well, we'll see tomorrow. We will finish up on Wednesday and have a test over the war between the states on Thursday. Sorry, it's the same day as Bible, but we'll see how that works out.
We won't finish Bible.
Probably.
That's like 5 sections in one day.